Europe's biggest military powers are drawing up plans for a phased withdrawal of the United States from the continent's defence. A managed transfer, they hope. This depends on three things. First, that the Trump administration can be persuaded not to simply lurch straight to the end point on a whim. It's tricky, but you can imagine it might just be possible with a bit of luck and lots of ego stroking.
This is really special. This has never happened before. This is unprecedented.
Second is that European nations behave in a bold, sensible and determined way to maximise their position in the short time they have available. That one, let me just say right now, hasn't really started well. We'll come back to that in a moment. Third, Europe has to resist rearguard attempts to imbue it with all the distinctive features of MAGA leadership. Yeah, we'll come back to that one as well. Leading the charge are the UK, France, Germany and the Nordic countries, who are engaged in what are described as informal but structured discussions. The aim is to come up with a step-by-step plan to move the military functions to European capitals. Once the plan has achieved the required degree of feasibility, it's then going to be pitched to the United States ahead of the planned NATO summit in June. Part of that plan will be the things that we've seen gearing up already. Firm commitments on increasing defence spending, for instance. A better rounded European force capability, filling in the gaps for which America is currently most needed. And then there's the discussion of the nuclear deterrent. At the moment, France and the UK have nuclear weapons, so there's an open question about how effectively they could provide a nuclear umbrella for the rest of the continent. Putting this plan into action is given a minimum time frame of 5 years, although anyone who knows about large-scale defence projects would probably suggest it's more likely to be at the other end of the range, 10 years minimum. So the pitch to Trump will be: keep doing exactly what you're doing now on the principle that at some point long after you've left office, Europe will finally be fully ready to take over. Now, I can't speak authoritatively for the US president, but I'm guessing that's going to be a tricky pitch to make. The trouble is, if you wanted Europe to be fully in control of its own defence, well, as the saying goes, you probably wouldn't want to start from here. One EU official told the Financial Times, "Increasing spending is the only play that we have. Burden sharing and shifting the dial away from US reliance. We're starting those talks, but it's such a big task that many are overwhelmed by the scale of it." Reportedly, US diplomats have told Europe that Trump remains committed to NATO membership and the Mutual Defence Clause Article 5 at the heart of it. But most Europeans will not trust that the diplomats in question are not apt to be as blindsided by their own boss as much as the Europeans could be. Or as another EU official put it, you need a deal with the Americans, and it's unclear if they will be willing to do it. Can you even trust them to hold to it? The momentum in practice at the moment is coming from the initiative being taken by the UK and France to develop a so-called coalition of the willing to look at providing a reassurance force for Ukraine. This de facto is providing the forum for discussions between more than a dozen European defence powers without the United States being in the room. And of course, it comes against a backdrop where the new €150 billion rearmament fund is being set up by the EU, and with a focus on building up Europe's defence manufacturing capacity and weaning its countries off US suppliers. And this is the part where it's already becoming obvious that, I have to say, ridiculous internal rivalries and politics are just already demonstrating how far Europe is away from being able to rise to the challenge. So yes, that rearmament fund is going to be operated according to a buy European principle. We've all seen, after all, how the United States was prepared to just switch off Ukraine's access to weapons and the intelligence services that helped make them operable, to the benefit of Putin's Russia, no less. So Europe has an interest in not being vulnerable to that. But it turned out today that British defence manufacturers are excluded from this work as well. Now, this is counterintuitive. UK defence companies such as BAE Systems and Babcock have masses of history and experience, and at a time when the continent needs to rearm quickly, and not from US sources, you would think that they would all be needed. Indeed, some of the capability gaps Europe will have to address with the withdrawal of the United States lie in exactly the areas such as air and missile defence and a number of others where the UK companies hold leading expertise. But the French President Macron insisted that the money could only be spent in EU member states or with countries that have defence pacts with the bloc, such as Japan and South Korea. The UK is not yet in such a defence pact, and Macron has said he won't agree to them having one, unless the UK agrees to give French vessels fishing rights in British waters. I kid you not. The Telegraph reported a UK government insider blaming the, quote, astonishing situation on, quote, puerile French officials who, quote, have not grasped the enormity of the moment. Now, even though it's the Telegraph talking, that doesn't seem to be a stretch in description. Some countries, such as Estonia, have already bought NLAW anti-tank missile systems with key components made only in the UK. Defence analyst Francis Touza said, quote, you will very likely have countries that say, we've bought NLAW, now we want more of those and we want to access the defence funds to do it. But in the case of Starstreak and NLAW, there are no French equivalents. Are you really going to tell them to buy a worse system? And is doing something that is deleterious to European defence really worth it for the sake of a few hundred tons of cod? There may well be a way forward to be found. It's not the EU itself that's putting up objections. It's not Germany or Italy or anyone else except for France. But it's not the only evidence of problems. Europe's top diplomat, Kaja Kallas, has been working to mobilise 40 billion euros worth of military aid to Ukraine to shore up its position on the battlefield, especially since Trump is now the only person left in the world who believes that a ceasefire is just around the corner. But by the end of this week, that plan was in tatters. An original version last month was vetoed by Hungary. A second attempt failed to survive patchy levels of support across the EU, where some in the coalition of the willing turned out to be significantly less willing. Even a significantly downsized version at 5 billion euros failed to get support from Slovakia, Italy, and, oh yeah, from France. Maybe she should have offered them some fish. So the fact that people are having to negotiate this sort of wrangling and manoeuvring for position right from the start doesn't make you optimistic that they will actually rise to the seriousness of the challenge ahead. And that's before you've even had the slightest interference being run by Vladimir Putin's Russia, as you would expect it to do. And maybe one of the forms of that interference dovetails with the final part of this, because while European powers are squabbling amongst themselves, others are looking to how the MAGA revolution could come to the continent with a view to dismantling the EU. The Heritage Foundation, which you'll know as the people behind the Project 2025 agenda that candidate Donald Trump spent the whole election campaign disavowing, and then President Donald Trump has spent the last 2 months implementing. Those folks, they are looking to move next to bringing down the European Union. The investigative Polish website V-Square revealed that the foundation held meetings with hardline right groups a couple of weeks ago to discuss a new paper titled The Great Reset. Sounds like a snappy title. Rings a bell. Can't quite place it. The Great Reset, Restoring Member State Sovereignty in the 21st Century. The essence of the paper is that if you want to undermine the EU as an entity, you rather build on the message and momentum that, after all, worked in pulling the UK out via Brexit. In other words, the argument that the EU is a quasi-federal state pushing ideologically motivated policies, by which they mean, of course, the wrong ideology. So they say that they want to pull that down and replace it with a differently constituted body, renamed the European Community of Nations. Such a new body would not have a European Court of Justice, it would not enforce equal rights and democratic freedoms and tedious things like that on its members. The plan was authored by Ordo Luris, which is supported by Poland's Hard Right Law and Justice Party, and MCC, which is directly funded by Viktor Orban's government in Hungary. When he spoke at Jordan Peterson's ARC conference in London last month, the Heritage Foundation president Kevin Roberts hinted at a ramping up of its work within Europe, saying that it would, quote, support our friends from Europe to reclaim their institutions. Indeed, he suggested that in this, we've drawn a line in the sand and we're ready to lead the world again. As recently as my last video, I asked if the autocratizing US was leading the world in the drift away from democracy. And here we are the very next day, at least some confirmation that certain figures close to the Trump administration are explicitly, not symbolically, explicitly seeing that as their next goal. The thing is, if you were a smart campaign strategist with a view to disruptive activity, as Steve Bannon in the US context or Dominic Cummings in the Brexit context, you look at European countries squabbling over fish rather than getting real about defence, and you would fancy your chances that divisive culture wars, targeted messaging and disinformation would absolutely get the job done. And the reason for that is that it's hard for anyone to deny that the EU has subsumed a lot of national sovereignty, which is after all why Britain did vote to leave, blaming everything that's wrong in your country on the decision makers that are conveniently out of sight. That's one of the easiest sells you can come up with. And the fact that the EU is a bureaucracy, apparently unapproachable. The fact that its leadership is, let's face it, a charisma-free zone. And the fact that the rivalries and the politics trends towards the petty, and you can see why the Heritage Foundation would fancy its chances. You know that the amount of money that will come in behind them to support it will likely be substantial. Heck, even Elon might throw in 100 million or two. I mean, it's not as though Tesla's going to be selling lots of cars in Europe in the short term. So let's face it, what has he got to lose? Sooner or later, the real scale of this challenge is going to sink in. It's hard to predict exactly what will happen at that point. Logically, you would think a subset of the more powerful defence countries will end up creating a core, unencumbered by the stragglers and the blockers, and hence not necessarily committed to the defence of the entire continent with the stragglers and the blockers. Logical, but a lot of water's going to have to pass under the bridge before we arrive there. In the meantime, and with very little involvement so far from Vladimir Putin and Russia, the battle for Europe is well underway.